Hey everyone, my name is Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us for the Undignified podcast, where we talk about worship, the church, and everything else. Today I get to have a conversation with my good friend Jon, and I want to tell you all about what he does, but he does a great job of describing what he does and what he cares about in this episode. But to kind of sum it up, we're going to talk about mental health. Now, you might be thinking, this is a church podcast, a worship leader podcast. What on earth are we doing talking about mental health? Well, mental health has been a big part of my journey, and I believe that ministers and pastors and worship leaders are all in roles where we encourage others, where we counsel others, where we hear about people's trauma and pain and joys and successes and failures. And it's about time that the church takes a deep dive into looking inward and caring about not just our spiritual state, but our mental state as well. So I think this conversation is going to be really, really helpful for you. And I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Undignified podcast. I'm so excited to have my friend, Jon Seidl here. How are you doing, man?
Man, I'm doing great. I love the title, right? Although it makes me want to be like, and remember that old one?
Yes.
I'll become
even
more. Yep.
Exactly. We want to dance like David did, et cetera, et cetera. It's a treat to have you. And I have we have a story. You and I have known each other for a long time, and I want to get into it. I want to talk about all sorts of things, especially your book and this journey you've been on when it comes to mental health and rest. But first, can you just give us where are you at? How are you doing? What does life look like for you right now? What are you passionate about? Wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, so I am currently living in a suburb of Dallas, Texas. So I'm originally from Wisconsin, small town boy. Went off to New York City, which is where I met the love of my life, Patrick, as well as my wife.
I was going to say, I didn't know where you were going with that. I was like, wow, thank you.
Yeah. So went off to New York City and was there. That's where we met and did a lot of life together for those years. And went from New York City, Denver for a year, back to New York City, and now I am in Dallas. And so what I do is I write. So I'm a writer and an author. And then I came up, my job, my living was kind of in the news business and digital media. And so now I'm a consultant for people who are in that space and, want to maybe grow a YouTube channel or something. I don't know. And
plug it, man. Just plug it all. I love it.
Yeah, right. So that's what I'm doing now. And really it's interesting. We can get into this later, but part of why I went out on my own is because of my mental health journey, right? I realized that I'm a much better person for my wife and my family when I don't have a boss. And I can, take that time. Like after this, Patrick, my day is planned out. I got up early. I knew this was happening. I knocked out a ton of work. And it's like, you know what? After this, I'm going to go on a run. I am going to kind of prioritize that because I haven't over the last few weeks because I threw out my back and I had a cold. And so, but I just love, I can do that. Right. And I don't have to, ask for permission or, hey, do you mind if I want to take a, quote unquote mental health day, I only have to ask myself if I want to do that. So that's what I'm doing now. I have two kids. 7 and 4. My daughter is in second grade and my son will be going into kindergarten. My wife and I have been married it'll be 14 years in a couple months. And she is incredible, boss woman. She has her own interior design firm that has just been wildly successful. And so it's been a great journey, and I just don't ever see myself leaving where I'm at now physically. But best laid plans. So we'll see. So that's my update.
I mean, it's so interesting that you mentioned that because immediately I want to schedule you for my other podcast, which is called Create, Post, Repeat. That is all about content creation, being your own boss. I didn't actually know that you were completely on your own now. That's amazing. How long have you been doing that?
So since about, right in the middle of the pandemic. So about almost 3 years now. And I took the leap. It was one of those where,
Yeah.
I was working kind of the quote unquote 9 to 5, but I was still in the content creation business. So, it's never 9 to 5. And I just realized, you know what, like I can still work for even the person and the company I was working for and just convert them to a client. And it's, they love that, right? They don't have to pay health benefits and kind of all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I get more freedom. So yeah, I've been doing it for going on 3 years now. And I could never go back. I just could never go back.
I mean, that needs to be a whole nother episode, like how you did that transition. I'm already inviting you back because I think that I've always known you as a writer. I've never known you. Actually, I've always known you as a lot of things. We'll get to that in a second. But I've never known you as a content creator. But when I think back about it, this interview, this conversation, of course you are. That's awesome. And let me actually rewind really quickly. We met early 2000s, mid 2000s ish, right, in New York City.
Yeah, 2005.
Yeah, and I was part of a team that was starting a church. You were at a university in New York City, and you're like, hey, I'm a musician. I play drums. You became like the worship drummer guy. We began leading worship together, having the time of our lives. I think the best way to describe it is failing forward, just loving life. I remember several times in a tiny little theater called the Triad Theater, us in like which is a place where they host like cabarets and stand-up comedy, tiny little club. Yeah. Us in the back room after like showing up at 6 a.m. to like set up just and if you don't know this is a worship podcast. So pastors, lead pastors, your musicians are in the green room backstage. So they're just laughing or falling asleep, and us just like rolling on the floor laughing, just tired, exhausted, whatever the joke of the day was, just rolling on the floor laughing, and just kind of like in the mess together of both like young men, me newly married, us like growing up, you in college, and now, here I am with, 3 kids. I'm a full-time worship pastor. You're a content creator. You're an author. And like, what a journey, right? I want you to really quickly tell us your book, Finding Rest, is where I want to spend a chunk of our time today. Can you give us just the kind of the overview of what your book talks about, who needs to read it, what's that journey been like, you releasing and publishing? Are you planning on something else? Give us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So in order to do that, I'm going to back up and actually hit something that you had said. And so sure. I will say that when we met and there were times the pastor would like get done with the sermon and be like, you guys have to really quiet down in the back.
Yes.
We're like, okay, sorry. But those were some of the sweetest, but also most stressful times of my life. See, because I had at that point undiagnosed anxiety. Right. I knew there was something different about me, but I didn't know what it was. And so, those, Patrick would like come with a cab at like 5 a.m. We'd load up the drums. And I remember once there was like a snowstorm and there was like one cab in the city and we got it and we're just sliding around, it was just insane, but it was awesome. And so my book really is about what is it like to go through life with a mental health diagnosis as a Christian, right? What did I learn? What have been the helpful things? What have been the unhelpful things? And so I wrote that book. It came out in the fall of 2021, and it did great, right? It became a top 100 bestseller on Amazon, and the reaction that I got to some of these chapters, especially the ones talking about what the church can do better and how you're not a bad Christian, you don't have a lack of faith if you struggle with mental health. The reaction was just so great. And so what then I did is, and this is part of the reason we're talking today, is I then created a workbook that kind of goes along with that book to allow people to really dig in, right? And it's kind of very Socratic method, right? I'm asking you questions and having you dig into your own, kind of junk and inside to really see what it's like to battle back against anxiety in a healthy way. Anxiety, OCD, depression. I got the trifecta as well. So this book is listen. I don't pretend to be a clinician. I don't pretend to be a pastor. I don't pretend to be a doctor. It's really a conversation between me and you, as a fellow sufferer, as a fellow someone that's on this journey that is an ongoing battle, right? And I talk about that in the book. So that's kind of the high level overview. And man, the reception has just been incredible.
Yeah, one thing I saw in the reviews on Amazon that I absolutely loved was someone said, so many glowing reviews about the book of, if you are struggling, this book is for you. But I also saw someone write, this book isn't just for those who are struggling with anxiety, OCD, mental health issues in general. It's not just for Christians. It's for people who might even know someone or be in a relationship with someone who is struggling. And that really hit me hard because I would say early in my marriage, so engaged June 2nd of 2005, married July 23rd of 2005, moved to the city, a brand new city, to live in a 12 by 12 studio apartment, sight unseen, for the first year of our marriage, August 4th of 2005. Early on, me and Teresa, my wife, were like, I think we should talk to someone, like a mental health professional, about marriage, relationships. And at that point, I fell in love, if one can, I fell in love with mental health and realized that for most of my life, it had been a very taboo thing. Mm-hmm. And you kind of touched on this, where it's maybe not your church, listener, viewer, John, Patrick, whoever, but there is this faith over feelings, faith over fear, even to the point of, if you're still struggling, maybe there's something wrong with you when it comes to your heart. You know, there's sin in the camp, kind of a feeling. Can we start there, and can you talk about, as someone who's struggled over the years and still does, what's that journey been like as a person of faith in a church, serving, doing all the things? What's that journey been like for you, both the successes and the failures?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy, that's for sure, right? And so one thing I just want to let everyone know, right, as I talk about this is to say, I don't pretend that I have all the answers. And what I mean by that is I'm giving you the truths and stuff that I know and that have helped me, right? Or maybe I should say it like this. I don't pretend that there is one magic pill, one magic prayer, one magic person, you know, I guess besides Jesus, right? That can take this all away. And so I'm still on this journey. And so it hasn't been easy, right? And so, in fact, in the book, I grew up in a faith tradition, evangelical faith tradition, that really said, if you pray hard enough, if you believe enough, if you give enough money, even, right? That one I audibly gasped. I was like, I've heard it. Yes. Yeah. You can have, you know, your father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? So you claim your healing, you know, kind of all that stuff. Time out to say, I believe that God heals, right? Yes. I've seen God heal, right? I pray every morning that God will heal me of this. He hasn't. Okay, so then what, right? And it's that question, the so then what, right? Because I think there's a lot of people listening to this. And there's a lot of people that reached out to me in the wake of the book that said, I grew up in a very similar faith tradition, which, by the way, I said faith tradition, not denomination, right? Because I think there's kind of some prosperity gospel stuff that has seeped into all denominations. It doesn't matter if you're Baptist or Pentecostal or Church of Christ or whatever.
Wow.
There's this idea, I call it like vending machine God, right? And you don't have to be a Pentecostal or Baptist to, you know, you don't own the stake on those things, right? That permeates a lot of our denominations. And so that's what I grew up in, right? I grew up in a vending machine God type tradition. And even I tell these, there's two important stories that I tell in relation to this in the book. The first one is the time that I realized that was untrue and that was a lie, right? The idea that if you just pray hard enough and have enough faith and repent and you don't have unrepentant sin and kind of all that stuff I was back home from college. So this is when you and I, really knew each other well.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge Packers fan. I grew up in Wisconsin, like I said. And the announcer, the DJ comes over the Christian radio station, by the way, Q90 FM, and says, "Hey, we got some bad news. Like Reggie White died." And so Reggie White was like they called him the Minister of Defense, right?
Yep.
He helped us. I say us as a Packers fan. I own a stock of the Packers. He helped us win our Super Bowl in '96. The guy he would preach at churches in Green Bay and in North Carolina, and he died of sleep apnea, right? And so I'm sitting there in the car. I can literally remember the intersection in the road that I was on. And my stepdad looks at me. He goes, "Huh, that's really sad." I'm like, "Yeah, that's really sad." He goes, "Too bad that Reggie had unrepentant sin." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, the Bible promises us 70 years. So he died in his sleep. He must have had unrepentant sin." And I remember getting this like righteous anger. I mean, I was so upset, but I didn't quite know why. Right. And so that started me on this journey towards what I call the most important book of the Bible, which is the book of Job. And it was realizing that God allows difficulties and tragedies in our lives to refine us and to redefine us, right? And I love C.S. Lewis. I have a copy of The Abolition of Man behind me, and C.S. Lewis talks about how pain is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world, and the truth is that you and I are very hard of hearing at times, right? Yeah. And so a loving God will allow us to go through things, right? I mean, you look at Paul, you look at the thorn in his flesh, the most the person that's the first face on the Mount Rushmore of faith, Paul, right, is like, yeah, you know what? To keep me from being conceited, God allowed me to go through this, right? And you look at Paul talking to Timothy. He's talking to Timothy, and he actually gives Timothy some advice to, drink some more wine for his quote unquote frequent ailments, right? So Paul and Timothy, two of these stalwarts, they continued to have these issues and these problems. And so when you look at the book of Job, what's important, and a lot of people miss this, is in the introduction, you think, oh, the devil goes to God and asks basically to torment Job. It's not. Like, the devil and God are having a conversation, and you know who brings up Job? It's God. So God, who Job, by the way, is called blameless and upright, right? So God brings up to the devil, "Hey, have you considered my servant Job blameless and upright?" And you're like, wait, holy cow. So God sometimes, allows those things to happen to us. And the truth is, yes. So all that to answer your question is, man, it was really tough. And in fact, when I called my mom after I was diagnosed and told her I was on medication, it was one of the hardest conversations of my life, because my mom was basically like, well, where's your faith? Right? What do you mean you're on medication? Yeah. And so that has been my journey, and it hasn't been easy, but I'll tell you what, I am thankful that God has allowed me to go through this. And like I said, I pray every day that he takes it away. He hasn't. So then what, right? And the so then what is really where the book and the workbook come from.
Man, there's a few responses I have. One is I also feel called to drink more wine for my ailments. I feel that needs to be a ministry initiative in 2023. I'm going to go talk to my boss about it. And number two, I mean, where I think, you and I should find out, where do we apply for the Mount Rushmore of faith? Like, is there like a junior version? I mean, like that would be great.
It's probably Branson.
Yeah. I also, I resonate with your story. I remember as a young child, being, something was off. And I'll make my story really short just for the sake of time. But like, I remember something was off, crying constantly, and eventually being diagnosed both with ADHD and depression, getting on medication, watching those things never disappear from my life, no matter how much I was prayed for or prayed. but watching medication help. And again, so like I said earlier, like I've always I've like fallen in love with mental health because it was such a part of my early journey that when my wife and I decide to sit down with, a marriage therapist who understands how the mind works and understands how our hearts feel in different ways and can kind of help us unfog or our minds or remove the cobwebs. It's been such an interesting journey for me as well. And I resonate so much with you in that, where throughout life, there's been just these marked moments of being like, something's different about me, and it's very difficult. And I feel like it's not just you and me, but yet mental health struggle, depression, anxiety, OCD is still, especially in, not all, but especially in church groups, religious groups, it's a taboo thing. Yes. So in writing your book and in your experience, is like, you told the story of your stepdad. Is that something you've run into? Is it something you still run into? And what would you say to people who are sitting around still going, well, I guess just the faith isn't there, or you haven't prayed enough or given enough, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, so I do still encounter that. I think we're getting better. Right. We as the global church are getting better, but we still have a long way to go. So yes, I still encounter that. Right. And so what do I say to those people? Two things. I'll start with this. Right. And this kind of goes to the medication aspect is so I'll reference actually that Paul and Timothy conversation. Right. And I talk about this in the workbook. Right. Is that if you think back, and I did some research, right? Like, so we joke about the wine, but wine was basically treated as like, it was like an elixir back in the day as well, right? It's like, you're down, drink wine. You're up, drink wine. You got a broken leg, put some tussin on it, as the old Chris. Was that like Chris Rock or something that had it? What I say to people is, so if you look at that passage, and I think it's 1 Timothy, you have Paul, who is prescribing a medication of the day to Timothy. That should tell us something, right? So let's just pretend instead of it's wine, it's like, it is cough medicine, right? And so Paul is prescribing that to Timothy. I think that's important, right? So what I tell those people is, if something physical is happening to you, and Paul can recommend something physical to help treat that, why can't we do that now? So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, man, we have no qualms about going to the doctor for a broken bone, but we have qualms about going to the doctor for a broken brain. Patrick, if I'm sitting here talking to you and you see a bone protruding from my arm, you're going to be like, hey, John, can you go to the doctor, get that set and fixed, and probably get some pain medication and get a cast on? Yeah, of course, right? And so I think that the church has historically treated mental health not as a physical issue, but only a spiritual issue. That's a problem, right? And so what I talk about in my book and workbook is, this is a both and, right? So the world treats mental health as only a physical problem, right? Yeah. That's not good. But the church treating it as only a spiritual problem, that's not good either, right? And so then I tell people, I say, listen, if I am going to actually, like, there are spiritual heart issues that I need to work through, right? And the number one is pride. My anxiety, my OCD is a pride issue, right? It tells me that I can control everything. That's why I get anxious. I want to control everything, right? But I'm never going to be able to work on those spiritual heart issues when my anxiety is at an 8. So I take my medication. It brings my daily, if you will, anxiety down to a 4. And at a 4, I can tackle both the physical and the spiritual, right? And so that's the mentality that I want, that I'm hoping to bring to the church. And then I'll end this response with this: is the church doesn't have a proper theology of suffering, right? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about in this, with these stories and these ideas of listen, if Paul struggled, if Timothy struggled, Charles Spurgeon actually had depression, right? The guy's called the Prince of Preachers, and he would counsel young pastors on how to get over what he called melancholy, right? So you have all these people, again, someone else that would be on the Mount Rushmore of faith, Charles Spurgeon, right? Struggling with their mental health. And so a proper theology of suffering says, I know my God can heal. He's allowing me to continue to go through this. And so it's bringing yourself to an understanding that our struggles are for our good and his glory. Now, I unpack that a lot more in the book and workbook because it can be kind of a hard concept at times, but it's coming to the understanding that if it's judging God, not by my circumstances, but judging my circumstances by who I know God is. Right. And he's going to allow us tragedy. He's to go through tragedy. There are things that he will not remove from us this side of glory. And I thank him for that because he knows better than I do that, I don't know, Patrick, like maybe I'm the most prideful, ridiculous person in the world without my anxiety and OCD. Right. Like, I mean, if you think back to the thorn in the flesh, what Paul says is to keep me from being conceited. So was Paul, maybe one of his internal heart issue and struggles was he kind of had a propensity to pride, right?
Yeah.
And the Lord knew that and allowed him to have this thorn in his flesh, whether that was a physical or a spiritual thorn. So that's what I tell people. That's the message that I'm hoping the church grasps now.
One of the reasons this conversation is so important to me is the Murphys, my family, we understand we're so privileged. We pay our bills. I'm never not hungry. You get it.
Yeah.
We live such a privileged life. We're here in New York City paying our bills. How many people can say that? It's incredible. But in addition to that, over the past, before pandemic, we just experienced personal, family, health, tragedy after tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Small things to really large things. And like I said, we believe in therapy, and I revisited my therapist, which I think is a really healthy thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's so great. And when we met together, he said, "Do you know we've been seeing each other for 11 years?" And I said, "I should be so much healthier. Like, what am I doing?" And he's like, no. And I started talking about just through tears, just some of the things I just couldn't get past. And he said, "I think," to your point, John, he said, "I think we forget." He said, "In my opinion, I think we forget that one of Jesus's main jobs here on earth was to teach us how to suffer."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for you to say we have an incorrect theology around suffering really speaks to my current reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I love what you said about if it's all this, it's wrong, but if it's all this, it's wrong too.
Yeah.
Can you give me a response to that? Like, I know this is just one therapist, one guy who's had a relationship with me for many, many years. Him saying one of Jesus's jobs here on earth was to teach us how to suffer. You just talked about suffering. Can you just expound on that just maybe a couple more minutes, like what your thoughts on that are?
So two things I'd say. The first thing is some of Jesus's parting words to us were exactly that, right? In this world, you will have trouble, right?
Yeah.
Now, has he come to overcome the world, right? But we know that like our life here isn't his ultimate, the ultimate determiner of if God is powerful or not, right? There's going to be stuff that happens after, and all that kind of stuff. And so the Lord is telling us we're going to have trouble. We are going to suffer. You have to look at the lives of the apostles, right? I mean, some of the most gruesome deaths you can imagine, right? But they went to their graves saying Jesus is good, right? Jesus is real. Jesus is alive, right? So I think we forget that Jesus told us, becoming a Christian, and this is where I get so upset with some of these prosperity gospel type people, is we become kind of animalistic about suffering, right? There's that old thing that like if a wolf caught in a trap, like he'll like gnaw his arm off just to get out of the trap, right?
Yeah.
And we take that same type of tenacious approach to I just never want anything bad to happen to me, right? And I think the shift in our mind needs to be, I mean, sure, I don't want anything bad to happen to me, right? But if it does, I know there's a reason for it, okay? Now listen, I'll add this one caveat. If I'm shooting up heroin in my arm every day, right? And I walk out into the street and get hit by a car, am I saying like, oh, that's God? Am I saying, I'm not saying there are never consequences.
I shouldn't laugh at that. That's not funny, but it's such a. I just imagine that scenario. Anyway,
right.
Far be it from me to say I wouldn't do that exact thing. See, I'm just being tested. Right. Anyway, continue.
Well, so the point is that like, yes, there are consequences for our actions, right?
Yeah.
Like if we're being stupid, right? It's like if you're sleeping around and you're a married man and you get syphilis, guess what? That was coming to you a little bit, right? Yeah. But this idea that like I didn't pray enough, I drank a little bit too much over the weekend, I really got into the wine for my frequent ailments or something, and like now the Lord is dishing out a little anxiety as punishment. It's just incorrect, right? And I go into depth in that in the book, but there's a difference. There's a difference between cause or. We like to treat God as a cause and effect God, and I don't think God's cause and effect like we are, right? In our kind of very limited understanding of how the world works, right? And so it's not like God is dishing out a little anxiety to you here for what you did 5 years ago, a little depression here because you kind of went sideways with your wife in that conversation, right? And so. I completely agree with what your therapist said. That listen, we don't understand how to suffer well, right? I think there, the early church understood that a lot better. I think especially us as the American church, we have a hard time with that, right? Yet it is. For hundreds and thousands of years, Christian suffering was a very real thing. Right. I mean, you look what's happening in China right now. Right. Yeah. Those people are being persecuted and they are still able to say God is good. Right. Yeah. And so that's what I'm hoping that that would be my response to your therapist. And that's what I'm hoping we can get to.
I think that's so incredibly helpful. And you answered one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask, or I definitely wanted to ask, which was how do faith and practical advice, how do they coexist in the mental health space? I think I think it's a really healthy question, especially for Christians or even someone who's new to Christianity and following the way of Jesus, and they're going, so I just should ignore all this? No. There's this beautiful coexistence. So I want to push you just a little harder, and I know Please. That you I know that you haven't claimed to be. Well, I am a mental health professional. I am a doctor. No, you're talking about your own lived experience, but you've written a book that's helped a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I want to push you just a little bit harder. Like, I remember the moment, like I was talking this past few years, where someone looked at me and said, hey, when we have conversations, like, are you with me? Like, and I looked at them and I said, I am barely hanging on.
Mm-hmm.
I am. And I might even get emotional here thinking about it because it's so fresh. But I just looked at them and said, you don't understand right now how hard it is for me to even exist in a room. I will literally be in a chair in a meeting and kind of wake up like, mm-hmm. Oh, I'm here. I'm supposed to be a present human being. And I also remember looking at a friend and telling them about how I was feeling and what my family was going through and saying, is God punishing me? Like, and I'm so thankful for that friend looking back at me and saying, Absolutely freaking not. I'm so thankful for that. But I want to push you a little bit harder and pretend you're in that scenario with the family who just miscarried. You're in the room with that person who lost everything in a bad business deal. You're in that room with that person who simply cannot get well while many people around them are getting healed, whether it's spiritual or physical medicine. Given all that you've just shared with me, what is the solace? If there is any, what is the conversation? What's your opening statement to that person?
Yeah. So first of all, and I talk about this in the book, is that we have to do better at sitting with people in their tragedy and their suffering, right? I think so many times I call it coffee cup Christianity, where you're with someone in this moment, and you're like, oh, just remember Philippians 4:13. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, right? And that it's like, yeah, that's great on a coffee mug on Etsy, right? But first of all, the context of that verse is ridiculous, because actually the context of Philippians 4:13 is Paul saying all of the tragedy that he's been through. I've learned to be I've learned to be content with much and with little, right? And then he says, and so in all things, and it's like, oh, he's actually talking about tragedy, not in the like, well, if you just, God's there so you can do all things. No, he's like, man, I've been at the bottom, and I know that God is real, right?
Yeah.
So I think what I tell people there is, first of all, I kind of talk about my own experience. Listen, I was in the room when my stepdad took his final breath during COVID from a massive stroke in his brainstem. One of the healthiest men that I ever knew. Right, the same stepdad, by the way, that we got sideways a little bit, talking about Reggie White in the Book of Job, but. So it's during COVID, like we're having to gown up. We can barely go in there for 5 minutes as they turn off the ventilator because he went brain dead. Right. And I can tell you that the peace that I got, in that room it literally is the peace that surpasses all understanding. And why is that? I credit the fact that I went through my own struggle with mental health over, the last decade, with giving me the perspective and the opportunity to have that peace. So part of what I tell people, and you got to do it in a non-corny way, right? But it's like, listen, this does not make sense, right? You can, and then I followed up with this. There's a difference between questioning God and asking God questions, right? Ask God your questions. We have lost the understanding and appreciation for laments, right? And so there's an entire book in the Bible called Lamentations. I don't know if I've ever seen a sermon series on Lamentations, right? But laments, I mean, if you look at, and I go through this, one of David's laments in the Psalms, what is so fascinating is, so laments are cries to God about things that are not right, right? My sister, driving down the interstate, mom to 3 kids, guy crosses the center line, hits her head on, she dies instantly by no fault of her own, and leaves 3 kids, right? I lamented, God, this is not right, And what you see in the Psalms, David lamented, Jesus even lamented on the cross, is God wants us to cry out to him when things are not right. Why? We are in that very process recognizing that he is the one that can fix it, right? Mm-hmm. And so our laments, our tragedies will bring us closer to him, and we cannot see that in the moment. And I get that, right? There are so many times I could not see that in the moment, but now when I look back, I can say that sucked, but man, God was there, right? And so I want to encourage people, like, my 7-year-old daughter, she comes up to my lap almost every night and says, I want a treat. I want a treat, right? She knows that, I'm not going to give her a treat every night. But that process of her coming to me with this request, right? There's a beautiful relationship that happens even when I say no, right?
Yeah.
That she knows that I'm the one who can deliver on this need, right? And that actually brings us closer together. So what I tell people in those moments is lament the hell out of what's going on, right? And be angry, right? Cry out to God. And what I can tell you is what I have found in my own struggle, whether it's the unexpected deaths of my sister and my stepdad in about a 2-year period, my own mental health, is that he is faithful to meet us. He is faithful to be there. And sometimes he will give us that physical healing. Sometimes he will give us that miraculous stuff. But you know what? And I think it happens more often. He says, you know what? I'm going to allow you to still go through this because I'm going to teach you something that, and that doesn't mean he's like this evil, well, I just need to teach Patrick a lesson,
Yeah.
No, he knows what's good for us. Right. And then finally I say, listen, I am not going to pretend that I have all the answers, right? I am not going to pretend that I know exactly why God has allowed this or what is going on, right? But it comes back to I have learned that I need to judge my circumstances by who I know God is. I know He is faithful. I know He is true, and I know that He has said He will use these things for our good and His glory. Romans 8:28, right? Okay, if those things are true, then I need to interpret my circumstances differently.
Everything you just said is amazing. And I agree that we have kind of lost that art of lamenting. We are fixers. We are not just waiters, not as in serving tables, but as in we have forgotten how to simply wait on the Lord. We sing that song, Waymaker. Even, when I don't see it, He's working. And I feel like there are, even when I don't feel it, He's working. And I feel like so many people sing that as I know He's doing it. And I know that there are plenty of people in the room on a Sunday morning or a Sunday evening or in a church setting or wherever, or in their car listening to that song as a angry declaration.
Sure.
Through faith, declaring it. Instead of just celebrate it before they're able to celebrate it. And I love what you said about, we don't want to question God, but it's okay to ask Him questions. And the Psalm is filled. We look at the Psalms for all of these, praise Him in the heavens, how high, how wide, etc. But the Psalms is filled with chunks of scripture of God, of David questioning God, like, where are you? Like, what are you
downright
doing?
Pissed.
Yeah.
Can I say that on this podcast?
You're allowed. You can say anything you want on this podcast. One area, and I didn't bring this up to simply, actually, I'm not tooting my own horn because I have nothing to do with this, but we have in the past year, my church, our pastor of care, her name is Genevieve. She's this amazing woman of God. She has created these services called A Tearful Heart. And I just want to read the description really quickly. Tearful Heart is an evening set aside for lament. It's a safe place to come and release your tears. Your tears are welcome. Your confusion is welcome. Your anger, frustration, and doubts are welcome. Bring your grief, your unmet desires, and shattered dreams. Come be held by the one who holds it all. For the majority of the church, they go, I don't think I should go to that. But for a large amount of people, maybe not the majority, they're going, that is exactly what I have been waiting for.
Amen.
And I think that, the many years I have spent as a pastor going, I'm going to fix this situation, has now been replaced by situations like this, where I find myself when people experience tragedy, that pastoral, like, I'm gonna pray for you, brother, and coming over, and instead of giving this diatribe of beautiful scriptures of what's on the other side, just simply placing my hand on people's shoulders, waiting on Holy Spirit and saying, God, that God can just, you're allowed just to experience every feeling you're experiencing right now in His presence. Let's just wait for a moment. I think we have lost that art, but I think ministry. I was going to say book, but I'm going to say ministries like yours, events like A Tearful Heart, and places where people can learn how to struggle, learn how to process pain. I think more and more of that is springing up, and I think the church will be changed because of it.
And that's, so I have a I have a chapter called The Prescription for the Church, and so I talk about the power of laments. And then the other, I mean, there's several of them recommendations in there, but the other one is more corporate worship. I'm not talking about Sunday mornings and the normal, if you will, church service.
Whatever.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm talking about things like A Tearful Heart, right? I'm talking about moments where, or services and gatherings where you just come and say, listen, we're not going to pretend like everything is great, right? We're going to just allow you a freedom, a freedom to have the fears, to have the doubts. I just absolutely love that, right? And so I think the church, those are two areas that they can do better. I think the other two are be okay with pointing us outward, right? Patrick, I mean, there's, you go to a counselor. I have a therapy session later today as well. I still go to therapy, awesome. Right? And I think the church gets so scared sometimes about pointing us outward to people, to resources that they can't control necessarily, right? I think sometimes the church gets really like, well, if I don't have a grief ministry in my church, then that's it, right? And it's like, no, there's counselors in the area. There are other, churches that have that, like, point them outward, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
So I do think, like, things like Tearful Heart, things like lamenting, things like pointing us outward, the church needs to continue to grasp those and utilize those for people that are struggling with mental health.
Yeah, and I completely agree with looking outward, because I mean, it's like we could use tons of different silly examples, but you simply don't know how your car works. You go to a mechanic. You don't know how your emotions work. You don't know how your brain works. And by the way, I think pastors especially have come into this place somehow where I'm a pastor. I'm often looked at as a guru in parenting, marriage, financial wisdom. Job, and I'm like, there's people out there that God has given an incredible mind to, that specifically, the amount of people I've said, have you considered counseling? That look at me and go, no. It blows my mind. I think that's a huge point. Can I shift just a little bit?
Please.
I want to talk, I could talk about this all day, but one thing I've hit recently, I want to talk, and I'm sure you've spoken to church staffs and pastors specifically. You said you're doing consulting on this topic. Am I right?
This topic and in the digital media space.
Yeah. Which, again, I want to talk to you about that as well. But I recently was speaking to, I go to both a therapist semi-regularly and a psychiatrist. Two different things. For those that don't know, a therapist a lot of times cannot prescribe things. Right. Whereas a psychiatrist says, yes, this is an issue. Let's try this. Let's try this health avenue, this medication, what have you. And I'm talking to my psychiatrist, and I said to him something, as I've been a church planter for 17 years. I've been leading worship and in some sort of church responsibility since I was 13. And during all of that tragedy that I experienced, and I'm sure I'll experience more tragedy in my life, unfortunately, I had this moment where I just realized I have been trained to believe, and you kind of hit on this earlier, Jon, that I'm not doing the Christian thing right, the ministry thing right, unless I'm suffering. And my psychiatrist, in a moment of clarity, looked at me and he goes, well, yeah, that's because in spaces like yours, the church, many times, not all the times, but many times, suffering has become a shortcut. And I said, what do you mean? He said, Patrick, you make a choice in your life. You've chosen to do the right thing. Let's pretend. I said, sure. And he goes, but because of that choice, you suffer. You lose something. You've made the right choice, but you lose something. And people a lot of times in religious spaces, Patrick, they begin to suffer and they go, oh, I'm doing the right thing. Because there has been, have you ever run into that? Or do you have any, it's kind of the other side. It's kind of looking at this from a different angle, but I feel as if, as a church planter, we are always ascending hills, you know? And there are those moments where it's like, speaking to the rest portion, there are those moments where it's like, wait a minute, maybe I need to slow down because I feel like I'm continuing to do the right thing because I'm suffering, my marriage is suffering, my family is suffering, my physical health is suffering because of how hard I'm going, how hard I'm moving. I must be doing it right. All this suffering must be an attack from the devil, when in fact, there's a moment where you're like, no, stop. You need to rest.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I haven't encountered that really. I wonder too if it is, because I'm in the suburbs too, right? So I'm in the suburbs where I have found the inclination is to pretend like everything is fine. I'm fine, you're fine, everything's fine, right? And so my work has really been more to like, let's just be real and honest about what you're going through and what's happening, right? And in fact, what I found a lot with pastors, and I talked to a lot of pastors during COVID, was that they started feeling, a lot of these, whether it was anxiety for the first time, depression for the first time, and because there was so much put on them during COVID, they felt like they could not show any sign of weakness, right?
Wow.
Because they felt like their churches were holding on by a thread, which, news alert, so many were, right? Yeah. And so I would say that's actually been a bigger thing that I've been encountering over the last 2 years is, hey, it's okay to say I don't have it all together right now, right? Mm-hmm. But where my mind goes when you talk about that, it kind of falls into what I was talking about earlier about like the church has historically made, and I would say not just mental health, but a lot of things they've swung the pendulum and said these are all spiritual, right? And so to your point, it's like I think that's a little bit of that same mentality of like, I'm encountering this, so it has to be spiritual, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, so last year so the book came out in 21, book releases, I hit last February, and okay, my spiritual, and I talk about the three-legged stool of mental health in the book. And if your mental health is the top, your brain, body, and spirit are kind of the three legs, right?
Yeah.
And so, brain, I was taking medication. Great. Going to a therapist when I needed it. Body, spirit. My spiritual life was great, right? I had, I was the proverbial person that was like getting up every morning and reading a devotional, right?
Crushing it.
Yeah. But I started slipping back into a depression, and I realized, my body was out of whack. I was so overweight, right? And that no matter what I did on those other two things, as long as my body was out of whack, that leg was gone and my stool was still going to fall. Right. And so it wasn't just a spiritual problem. It wasn't just a physical problem. So I went on a diet. I lost 70 pounds and man, it did wonders. Time out though, to say this winter, guess what? I was hit with another round of depression, right? Well, why, John? You just said you lost 70 pounds. And because then I realized my spiritual life did get out of whack. I put so much focus on getting my body in tuned, right? That I let the spiritual aspect then start to wane, right? And so my struggle over the last 3 months has been like this realization and waking up like, wow, I need to get back to putting as much effort into my spiritual life as I did in losing 70 pounds, right? So that's why I'm back in therapy. I'm back in counseling, right? So it's a long answer to your question to say that I think we as a church continually will try to chalk a lot of things up to being spiritual. Doesn't mean they're not spiritual aspects to them, right? Doesn't mean that the devil can't use, my my physical weight in a way, right? But we have to treat them kind of in a three-pronged approach.
I went to the doctor a couple of years ago, and doctor comes in, they check the weight, they check the blood pressure, they do all this stuff. Doctor finally comes in. She asked me, like, how are you feeling? And I'm like, this hurts. I don't feel good about this. This is going on. And just list off like 12 things. And she just looks at me, and in this really thick, like Middle Eastern accent, which I'm by no means going to try to do, she just looks at me and she goes, all of this goes away if you lose the weight. And I was so offended because I wanted her to be like, oh yeah, we're just gonna like put you on this thing, and why did she refer to it as the weight? I was like, and I was just like, and like that was the conversation, like that was it. And
she's like, this is easy, cut and dry.
And I just imagine her looking at me going like, mentally, you're top notch, Patrick. Spiritually, I can tell you've got a glow about you. Lose the weight. And I was just like, she's right. She was so right. I was so offended. But I think you're right. Like I love the three-legged stool. Like we hyper focus on spirituality, which I think is kind of like a running theme in a lot of what you're saying, but it's all connected. The mind, the body, and the spirit.
Yeah, the different heresies in the history of the church, right? There was a heresy that said, you made everything about the body, right? Heresy. But then there was the other heresy that said physical body doesn't matter. It's all spiritual. Well, yeah, they're both heresies, right? So you have to find that middle ground, right? And I think sometimes too in churches, like we want to be known for that thing. Like, hey, we're the church that does, I don't know. We're the church that does healing rooms or something like that, right? Yeah. And it's like because you want to be known for that thing, then you kind of ignore some of this other stuff, right? And it's like, no, we are multifaceted beings, right? God made us that way for a reason. He didn't have to give us physical bodies. He did, right? Yeah. And listen, there are things that are a result of the fall that we will continue to struggle with, for all human time, right? But yeah, it's finding that balance. And I hope what people don't hear me saying is, again, I believe that there are spiritual issues at work with my anxiety and my OCD. Absolutely 100%. Yeah. Right. So I'm not out here like, well, Patrick, if you just lose the weight, then the depression will go away. No, because there are so many other things. Right. But let me put it this way. It is prideful of us to tell God that he can only heal us or help us in the way that we want him to, right? Sure. And so I've encountered this a lot with medication, right? And Christians, and I talked to a lot of pastors about this during COVID, who again weren't like prosperity gospel pastors, but like, I just don't want to get on medication. A, I just don't want to be on it for the rest of my life, and B, like, I just think I need to be praying more about it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That is pride. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, medication, for example, is a common grace, right? It's a common grace that God has given to all men, right? Just like the ability to taste food, the sun that shines, the rain on the just and the unjust, right? And so if you're out here saying, God, you can help me in any way but that, right? Convince me that's not a pride issue, right? You're saying you want to control how God can help you. right?
Yeah.
And so I tell this kind of like fable, and it's, so there was, and maybe you've heard it. So there was this flood, right? And this guy, the rain starts rising. It's kind of up to his ankles, and he prays and he says, God, I know that you can save me. Please come through. And so like he's sitting there, he's praying, and this police cruiser comes by and says, hey, sir, hey, water's rising. Can you come in? He's like, no. I'm praying. God's got me.
Yeah.
Okay. The water rises again. It gets up to his chest. God, please save me. Please. I know you can do this. Boat comes up. Hey, sir, get in. No. I'm praying. God's got me. Okay. Water rises again. He gets up, on the roof. God, please save me. Helicopter comes. Sir, please get in the helicopter.
Right? I love the sound effects. Love it.
Yep. And he's like, no. I'm praying. God's got me. Guy dies. He goes to heaven. He talks to God. He's like, God, I was believing in faith that you were going to heal me, or that you were going to help me. And God looks at him and says, I sent you a car, a boat, and a helicopter. What more did you want? Right. Yeah. And so for me, like the medication, the I hate running, Patrick. I hate running. I ran 2 half marathons last fall. Why? Oh. Because I know that when my feet hit the pavement, it is scientifically proven to help my mental health. Right.
Yes.
God has given me 2 legs to be able to run and walk. And if I'm sitting there saying, oh, well, God, please, you can, I want the miraculous part, but I don't want to get off my butt. And by the way, I hope you hear this. Like, I'm not coming against you, because I know we were kind of joking about weight, right? But I just get so frustrated when people are like, I'm praying that God will heal me, right? And God's like, here are the resources. Really great things.
I will say, you said earlier that you pray every day for God to take away your mental illness. He has not done that yet. I pray for supernatural metabolism. Some people have it. I just don't. And I feel like I feel like that's a gift that the Lord wants me to have. I'm pressing into it from glory to glory, from strength to strength. The last thing I wanted to just touch on briefly and kind of just hear your thoughts on is one thing that was, speaking of like, this past few years of my family's life and some tragedy. Oh, actually, let me say one thing first. When you were talking about someone saying, I don't want to be on medication, I don't want to be on it, I don't want to lean on it, I want to lean on God kind of a thing, and you going, wait, I'm sending the cruiser, I'm sending the boat, I'm sending the helicopter. Yeah, I had a conversation once with someone where I was talking about the medication I take, and they just looked at me and they just said, and it is a person I love, a friend of mine, and they said, I just don't know if I'd want to walk around drugged up all the time. And they had no idea in that moment. And I can be thick-skinned, speaking of the weight, I can be thick-skinned, but how deep that hurt me. Mm-hmm. And looking at someone where I'm like, and I looked at them and I said something, very kind, not defensive or anything, where I said, I think if you could walk around with these feelings or these struggles, I think you would understand. And dude, praise God that you don't have these mental issues or these learning challenges or this physical disability. Thank God for that. But until you have kind of, I know this sounds cliche, but until you've experienced that issue, far be it from you to say, oh, I wouldn't, I wouldn't want to take that medication, which speaks to that, or whatever the case may be. So those are really hard conversations, and I totally appreciate your perspective on it. And one thing I want to say, I kind of want to just hear your thoughts on this, wrap up with this or whatever, but one of the best things in my life after experiencing, just a few pretty significant tragedy, trauma bits of my life over the past few years, one of the best things that happened to me was a sabbatical. After 17 years of ministry, I took my after 17 years of like real on the ground, I'm an adult now ministry, I took my first sabbatical. I took 3 months where I didn't go to church. I didn't work at a church. As a matter of fact, let me just speak to that really quickly. I'm sitting at a charity poker table, of all things, and a pastor that I used to work for said, "Oh, you're about to take a sabbatical?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's going to be weird though, because I don't know, like, I guess I'll just show up to church on Sundays because I got to go with my family." He goes, "Don't go to church." I said, "Oh, no, I'm not working." He's like, No. Cut the tie. It's a 3-month period. Cut the tie. And I know this sounds really controversial. Don't go to church, but spend the time with your family. Find out what it's like to exist outside of your role. You know that if you walk into that building, you will not find rest. Not everyone knows you're on sabbatical. You're going to get asked to do this. You're going to get pulled into this. You're going to be, people are going to be like, "What's the deal?" And it was like in a good way, an earth-shattering experience for 3 months and I'm thankful for the opportunity. I know how privileged it is. I know that not everybody has that opportunity, but to simply step away and gain perspective. I learned things about boundaries that I never knew before. I learned there was things that I was complaining about in my work that were actually my fault. And I had the space to process. I dipped into counseling once again and talked to therapists and talked to counselors and talked to psychiatrists. It was just, so I don't know if when you talk about rest, if you ever consult or discuss or experience people who are on sabbatical and had anything to shed light on it, but it was a massive shift for my life.
So, yes, what I tell people is, there's the great book that I'm sure a lot of your audience has heard, The Celebration of Discipline.
By
Richard Foster, right? And in that book, he talks about how important it is not to check out, but to kind of rejuvenate, right? Yeah. And it is kind of one of those lost arts, right? Because we are so plugged in right now, right? We are more plugged in this day and age than we have ever
always
been,
accessible.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, we have to practice it. And I think that gets to the heart of what you're talking about, right? You have to practice rest, right?
Yep.
And but I also want to clarify something. So the title of my book, Finding Rest, Navigating the Valleys of Anxiety, Faith, and Life, and then the workbook, Finding Rest, An Invitation to Go Deeper. I need to define for you what I mean by rest, right? Because I think there's a lot of people who are like, okay, so this is finding rest. So it's this like these 10 steps and then I can find rest, right? And what I tell people is when I talk about rest, I am not talking about a final destination. I'm talking about rest as respite. It's kind of like rest as rest stops along your journey, because you can get just as enamored with just like a lot of people are enamored with go. There are plenty of people who are enamored with, well, I just can't do anything today, right? This is my rest. And meanwhile, your wife is bawling because, she's trying to do something with the kids, and you're like, no, babe, this is my Sabbath. I'm on rest, baby. But
don't you care about me? Yeah.
Yeah. I treat rest as respite, and kind of the tools that I talk about in the book and the workbook are really how do you find those moments where you're done with a battle, not the war. You're done with a battle. You go back behind the lines. You rest up. You heal. You lick your wounds. You eat, right? Like we were given the armor of God, and in that whole idea is the fact that we are going to have frequent battles, right? Yep. Well, you wouldn't need armor if you weren't going to be in battles, right? Yep. So the assumption is that we are going to be in battle in numerous times throughout our lives. And so it's finding the rest between those battles, those rest stops, that rest as respite. And I think that's important. So my point and kind of what you're getting at too is practice rest, right? Yeah. So my phone's here, right? I have a lockbox for my phone, right? I need to be better about using it, right? But I have one of those little lock boxes. You put it in there, and it's like that's it. That's a way for me to practically practice rest, right? Putting my phone, across the room, forcing myself to go on walks, not even runs, right? I talked about running, right? But sometimes that's a task, right? That's something for there's an end goal. I want to lose weight, or I want to run this half marathon. The hardest things for me are not the runs. The hardest things for me are the walks. Why? Because I'm forcing myself to slow down, right? I'm forcing myself. And this is where, there's a practice called mindfulness that I use a lot, which I actually think is a biblical principle. And I talk about that in the book, where I feel like Jesus kind of introduces this concept of mindfulness, but forcing myself to just be present and in the moment, right? And so we have to practice that and be better about that.
That's so good, man. I think like I want to end it there, because you kind of you summed it up with like, rest is not a destination. Rest is a thing that happens along the journey. And I will say this, because I mean, I think this is the perfect way to kind of sum it up. But feel free to disagree with me. It's like, Jesus begins his ministry baptized, literally the Holy Spirit falling on him like a dove. The Lord looks down, God looks down and says, "This is my son with whom I'm, well pleased." Or in Mark, it actually says, God says, "You are my son, with you I am well pleased." And what does Jesus do right after that? How does he start his ministry? 40 days in the wilderness. Now, he was tested during that time, but what was the discipline there? Rest, separation, time with the Lord, time to get his thoughts right. And I think that, I'm so thankful for the ministry you provide in helping people through your story, find the rest they need, through your story, find the help they need when struggling things, or when being in a relationship with someone who does struggle with mental health issues. So I'm so thankful that you took the time to talk to us today. But before we wrap up, like, where can people find you? Where can they hear more or read more of what you've done? Are you involved in social media? Like, where can people find your stuff and hear more about what you're doing?
Yeah. So the best thing to do is I created a URL that brings you to a special page on my website. It's called findrestnow.com, findrestnow.com. And so if you go there, that's kind of like the landing page for, you can get the book, the workbook, you can, watch videos. I have a course on anxiety coming out next week.
Awesome.
And so I will be putting some more information on that page about that, but that's a course that it's like I think it's almost a 20 video course that uses the truths of the book, uses the workbook, and kind of presents it to you in this, better format that I like, where we are literally having a conversation. And so if you go to findrestnow.com, you can see where you can get the book. I mean, it's on Amazon. It's, it's everywhere that wherever great books are sold. Although I don't like saying that, because there's invariably like that one bookstore that doesn't have my book. And it's like, oh, is your book not a great book? You said wherever fine books and great books are sold,
Yes.
But yeah, just findrestnow.com and that'll kind of bring it. And just, I mean, thank you for the conversation, right? I think, I talked about that we're making progress. And so I think when church leaders like you are wanting to have this conversation, we are making progress, and it's important. And so what I encourage churches to do is just listen. There are more people, if you're a pastor listening to this, if you're a lay leader listening to this, there are more people struggling with this than you realize in your pews, right? And, again, I'll use that example of Charles Spurgeon. If Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, can sit there and be having depression, you can bet that, Chucky Sparlink that's in the back row, can struggle just as much. And so, embrace lament, embrace that proper theology of suffering. Just talk about it, right? I mean, it's like, every year we have a Father's Day sermon. Man, I'd love for every church to have a mental health sermon every year, right? Just talk about suffering, talk about laments, talk about what it looks like to sit with people and not have the answer. Talk about, hey, we're not gonna be a coffee cup Christianity church, right? We're not gonna, I can do all things with a verse taken out of context. So, I hope that this conversation continues, and I just thank you for having it.
Absolutely. I mean, you bring up Philippians 4:13. You brought it up a couple times. I had a poster in my bedroom growing up with Philippians 4:13 and a very short man dunking. If that's the theology that we were raised in. Hey,
Right.
thank you so much for this conversation. It was super, super helpful for me, and I know it's going to be helpful for others. Everybody check out Jon's website. We're so glad that you were here, and I have to schedule another conversation with you because this was really fun. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks, man. Love you, brother.
All right, you too. Bye. Thank you so much for joining us. Links to everything you need can be found in the description. And as always, if you need to get a hold of us, you can shoot us an email at theundignifiedworship@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram @thisisundignifiedworship. We'll see you next time.